So I wanted to make this really quick video so I can get my thoughts out there on how to evaluate cards for your sideboard in best of 3, and specifically for MTGA Arena on ladder, because tournaments are a little bit different in the way that you have more opportunities to kind of mess with your opponent in the sideboard or like prepare for a more specific metagame. When I say mess with your opponent, I mean like putting random one-ofs in there, like one spell pierce and stuff like that. Not really for this deck, but other decks. And also, the metagame being more narrow means that you're more ready for more obvious decks that are popular and good. Whereas on Arena, you have to be ready for just about anything, really. You can face random brews, you can face decks that are like tier 2, but like have like specific matchups where they're really good against. So it's kind of surprising on Arena. You can face so much. So you have to be ready for a lot more, which means that your tools have to be more applicable to a lot of decks. Now, specifically, this discussion started when someone mentioned Thrall, and I've been going over it on stream over and over, but I kind of forgot that I didn't put it in video form yet as to why I don't value Doorkeeper Thrall highly at all in this deck. And that comes from I guess it would be 3 criteria, I think, or I don't know. There are multiple criteria, but let's go into a few that I think are really important. One is the primary purpose of your sideboard, in my opinion, should be to either play, so there are 2 things. One is to play cards that are extremely high impact in the most matchups possible. And 2 are going to be cards that are good in the matchups where your deck struggles, so the bad matchups. And I think the primary thing you should do in a sideboard is focus on that second criteria first. So the bad matchups. I think your sideboard should be primarily there to shore up your weaknesses in the matchups that are more difficult. And the matchups that are more difficult for control specifically are going to be decks like Ramp, decks like the Mirror, decks that are combo oriented, that, you know, once they resolve something, you just lose the game, and very specific aggro decks like Mono Red, for example. So let's talk about Thrall when we're evaluating through the criteria here. So does this help me in any bad matchups? Not really. So the matchups where Thrall is good against is Ramp, right? So Ramp, it's good. It's good against Boros, and it's good against Rakdos Discover. There's probably like other random matchups, but again, I don't value those that much. We're going to talk about the matchups that are more popular first. And in those matchups that are more popular, only one of those is something I would really consider the Thrall for, and that would be against Ramp. I think the Boros matchup is extremely easy, and I think the Discover matchup is pretty easy. So those 2 matchups are favored, and Ramp is like kind of 50-50 sometimes, depending on your sideboard options. Mostly because of Cavern of Souls, really, but otherwise it's a pretty easy matchup. So it's mostly about the Cavern of Souls being kind of annoying, and actually they have a lot of card of it. Never mind, that matchup is actually 50-50. Never mind. Okay, yeah, Ramp is hard. If they have the right tools in the sideboard, it becomes really hard. So doesn't really help me, and really helps me against Ramp. Okay. Now, what cards in my sideboard do I have here that are already doing that against Ramp? Tidebinder, Negate. Those 2 are already 4 slots in my sideboard that are cards that are extremely effective against Ramp. And Tidebinder is quite literally doing the exact same thing that Thrall is doing, although it's not a static. But the trade-off is that Tidebinder is much more effective against other matchups that are hard. I'm mostly talking about, you know, Esper. Esper's hard, really hard. And also the Mirror match. The Mirror match is always going to be a matchup that is baseline 50-50, and that you have to, I think it's really important to actually get an edge in a Mirror, because otherwise those matchups can be extremely insufferable, and they last, specifically for blue-white, these Mirror matches last forever. So you have to, I think having tech cards for the Mirror is really important. So the value of Tidebinder already higher than the Thrall because it's hitting more bad matchups. The impact against Ramp might be a little bit lesser in terms of like the actual impact of the card. So this has the potential of disrupting more things, but that doesn't mean it's all upside compared to Tidebinder, because Tidebinder is a 3-2, which means you have a faster clock at hitting your opponents. Now, again, there are upsides and downsides to both. This stops more things. It's cheaper, so it fits into your curve better. but the amount of pressure you're putting on your opponent is pretty much non-existent. That might not matter if you're going for the mill game plan, but it's nice to have an alternate potential damage plan going as well. So pros and cons to both in the ramp matchup, but the cons of the Thrall being limited to very specific matchups, whereas this is more applicable to a wider variety of matchups, is where the Tidebinder shines more. Now, should you play Tidebinder and Thrall? Now, here's another thing that I think you should consider is how many of the same type of effects should you play? And the problem mostly comes down to how many available slots you think you have in your sideboard, because there's a priority on the variety of different spells that you want in your sideboard, like different effects. You want a variety of different effects because that will apply more to the general state of the metagame and to the general, decks that you can face, like the variety of decks you can face. And high priority on that list is going to be more spot removal. So we have like Elspeth Smite, Destroy Evil, and March. More sweepers that are very impactful in the Boros matchup, for example. So you can't replace like Sunfall with Thrall in the Boros matchup because they're about as effective, right? So it's more impactful to have the Sunfall that is more applicable to other creature decks as well. And you can't really cut the spot removal in my opinion as well. Now, the number of spot removal spells you have in your sideboard is variable. If you think you don't need Destroy Evil, for example, and you have that one extra slot and you're like, what do I do with this? You might be able to play a Thrall. That is not the case for me. I do think I need every single spot removal spell in the sideboard, so 3. Then we can evaluate the cards like, more card draw. You can't really replace card draw with a disruptive effect in Thrall. Wait, I should put the Thrall in the deck. What? Okay. Let's just... I keep going back and forth. It might be a little bit frustrating here. Okay, so you can't really replace the variety that you get from... it's not really variety, but the effect of card draw with the effect of disruption. You can't really do that, and I wanted more card draw, so that is not a thing. You're not really replacing counter magic. No, you're not. You're not really replacing. Negate in the mirror is not even close to like the same effect as Thrall, right? Whereas, I guess again, specifically ramp, you could argue that countering a non-creature spells. No, you can't. No, this is more against creatures, so it's kind of redundant. This is a non-creature, so you wouldn't really compare that. So that's not really comparable. Again, speaking of high impact cards that hit very specific matchups extremely hard, you have Hearse. Hearse's value goes up even more because it also does something that your deck cannot do, whereas Thrall kind of does stuff that your deck can already do in counter, like straight up countering, right? Like Dissipate and Normalize, whereas this is something your deck cannot do, interacting with the graveyard. So this card is like a no-brainer. I would say the 2 cards in this sideboard currently that you would always play, no matter the list you're playing, is going to be at least 2 copies of Tidebinder and 2 Hearse. These are the cards, this because it's applicable to like everything, and it's super impactful in some matchups as well. This because it's super impactful and does something you cannot do, and helps you tremendously in those matchups that are difficult, by the way. If those matchups were easy, you would probably not need this, right? Or you would definitely not need this. The fact is that those graveyard decks are difficult to beat without Hearse. Very high value Tidebinder. Now, again, difficult matchups, we're going to have the mirror match and we're going to have ramp. So I'm adding 2 more cards for those matchups. And again, not specifically for ramp, otherwise I'd play the Thrall, but I'm afraid of the mirror as well. And what cards can apply to both of those? You have Realmbreaker, which ramps you and mills, contributes to your mill game plan with the Jace, and another Jace, which contributes to your game plan of milling with the Jace. And Jace is a card, or mill in general as a win con, is something that gets more powerful the more you have it in your deck. That's why we have the fourth Jace. And just a quick side tangent about Jace specifically. As I just mentioned, it's a card that works the more you have of it, right? So when you're considering your main deck, if you're playing 2 Jace, I think that would be wrong, for example, because Jace is a card that needs minimum 3, I would say. The 4th copy is like kind of too much maybe, but if you're cutting it down to 2, it will just not be effective as a mill game plan. It's just not enough mill, so you probably would be better off playing 0. So in my opinion, you're playing 0 Jace or 3 Jace minimum. 4 would be decent, but again, the thing is with the main deck, you need a wider variety of tools because of the wide metagame that you can face on Arena. So you're going to have to lessen the amount of specific cards that are very good in specific matchups. While Jace is applicable to, aggro matchups still because it has the +1, which reduces damage, there are more effective things against aggro than Jace. That's why I still have 3, because it is still something that is decent against aggro, but it is also really good against control and ramp. So that's why we have 3. But I'd much rather have, instead of the 4th copy, something like, the third Sunfall, the spot removal spell, counter spell, like anything else in the deck that you see, I'd rather have that over the 4th Jace. Let's put the throw here. Okay. And speaking of Sunfall, I do have the 4th copy of Sunfall in the sideboard because, again, it's a card that is extremely devastating for certain decks, and it's applicable to pretty much any deck that is trying to set up creatures, which is a lot of decks. So again, the application is wide, the impact is very high. That means I should play the 4th Sunfall in the sideboard. And it was in the main deck originally as well, so that gives it more. If you were considering a card in your main deck, then you probably should have it in your sideboard, right? Usually that means you're pretty much set on playing that card somewhere in the deck. So it should be in the sideboard. That's usually a default thought. I'm just saying, like, you think, okay, I want 4 to deuce, which is the case here. I was like, okay, I want 4 to deuce. I don't really know what to cut. I'm just going to throw the deuce in the sideboard because I think in the main deck, you probably want more cards that interact than just draw because of the speed of the meta. You want your card draw to be super impactful. Like, at least Deluge, it's harder to justify cutting it because Deluge acts as 2 card draw spells in 1, potentially. While it is more expensive, the power level of Deluge is much higher than Deduce, right? So if you're comparing both of them and thinking about what do I cut for 1 slot, you would always cut the Deduce, essentially, because it's more of like a dirtily, like, it's not a super high impact card. Usually you're looking for the most impact in the main deck to try to win. So yeah, I have the 4th Deduce because I was considering it already in the main deck, and I want more card draw. So if those things align, it's got to be Deduce. So there you have that. Now, Cathar Commando isn't... Oh yeah, and then we have Fairy Mastermind, which is pretty interesting. Okay, so Cathar Commando. Cathar Commando is filling the slot of, okay, I need to interact with artifacts, and I have nothing that interacts with artifacts, other than March, I guess, but I wanted something that is applicable to, interact with artifacts, but is also good in other matchups. As I mentioned, it's always important to have cards that are impactful in the most matchups possible. Cathar Commando does fit that bill because it's going to be effective against creature decks because you can block. You can use it as a 2-mana removal spell. It's not too effective, obviously, because they have to attack, and they can interact with it as well. So it's not that effective, but this is one of the better cards if you're looking to interact specifically with artifacts. The key factor here was that I needed a card that deals with Celestis against control, and there's pretty much nothing that's better than this, because it's a creature, it can attack as well if they don't have Celestis, and it can destroy Celestis for 1 mana later down the line if they ever play it. So that was the primary function of the card, and then the fact that it also applies to aggro decks in some way is relevant. So that was pretty much the perfect card for me. That was exactly what I wanted in that slot. And comparing it to March, for example, March is a spot removal spell that also can exile artifacts. It can also exile whatever you want, basically, other than planeswalkers, right? I think, yeah. Oh, no, it specifically says artifact, creature, enchantment. I didn't know that. That was like, wait, why would it be non-planeswalker permanent? I don't know. Okay, anyways, the problem with March specifically is that, as I mentioned, I think earlier, decks in Standard are super fast, and they're extremely efficient in mana. They're extremely mana efficient. And the problem is, if you are paying a premium to remove your opponent's thing for +1 cost, right? You are at a tempo loss. And Control is already a deck that can fall behind very quickly if you don't have the right tools. So having a card that is slow but flexible is not that good. Instead of having something that is extremely effective, like Smite, for example, early game. Because if you get run over early game, sometimes it's really hard to turn the corner against some of these aggro decks, specifically if they have burn. I'm talking about mono red specifically. And this will mostly apply to decks that have a curve that is actually a curve, right? Not like 1 mana, like 1 drop, turn 2, 2 1 drops. In that case, March is like, okay. But if they're doing 1, 2, 3, 4, you're always at a disadvantage, and it further plays into play draw, where when you're on the draw, you're even further at a disadvantage, right? Because then you're also 1 mana down. So you're 1 mana down and you have to pay a premium. So this gets pretty rough when we're talking about specifically aggro decks, but this is more so for the slower decks, I would say. But since it's also applicable to the aggro decks in some way, it's worth something. Now, Fairy Mastermind is my flex slot. So this is the slot that was left after I went through the list, and it's also the slot where I was considering Thrall. Now, the difference is I was playing against Esper, and I realized that I really wanted something that was decent against the bat and also, has to be applicable in other matchups. So I was thinking, okay, well, this card is like okay against the bat, right? You can block it, you can stop it from ETBing, and you can also apply this to the Domain matchup, the Boros matchup, and the Rakdos matchup. But again, Rakdos and Boros I would consider to be easy matchups. And the primary function for this as well would be to block aggro decks, right? And a 2/1 blocks aggro decks much more. So I can use this as a pseudo removal spell as I was using for the Cathar Commando, right? So it's kind of the same role where this is applicable to Control Mirror because they're using Deduce potentially, and you can make them draw as well with the activated ability. It's applicable for Ramp while it is less effective against Ramp as the Thrall is. It's less effective against Ramp, but again, as I said before, it's more applicable to different matchups that are more difficult. So it's better against Control than the Thrall is. It's better against aggro than the Thrall is, unless specifically we're talking about Boros. So we're talking about like if we're against mono red, you'd much rather have a Fairy Mastermind because the 2 power actually trades with stuff. So that's also a thing. It's better against Esper because while this stops the bat, it has no blocking capabilities. And this actually draws you cards once they have Rafinda on the board. So that's another application, right? So it's just more stuff that the Fairy Mastermind gives to me in the harder matchups that makes it more appealing, while it is less effective in one specific matchup, I guess, which would be Ramp. And then this doesn't help me at all against Boros, and it is actually okay against Rakdos because it blocks the Harvester and the 3/2 Discover creature. So even in that matchup, it's not bad. And they also have blood tokens that you can potentially get them with the card draw if they're trying to draw. So it's not completely worthless there as well. Again, it's a card that is just kind of good against everything, really. It's just you're kind of always fine with the Mastermind, whereas this you're like either really happy or it's not really that good. So as a flex slot in my last position, I'd rather have a Fairy Mastermind. But again, at the end of the day, it depends on your goal, because some people, or at least the way I sideboard, might be different than the way you sideboard, where I'm sideboarding to try to gain the highest win percentage upgrade in the harder matchups. And I want to hit the most matchups possible. There's another way of sideboarding that would just be, I'm seeing a lot of this deck, I want to beat that deck. In that case, or I want to beat multiple decks that are specific. So let's say I want to crush Boros and I want to crush Ramp, right? Then you'd be like, okay, well, I'll just play Thrall then. So depending on your priorities, you might consider Thrall to be a higher value, right, than I do. I just want to beat everything. And for that reason, I have to make sure my tools are applicable to more different matchups, even though they might be less impactful on very specific matchups. And I care more about the bad matchups than the ones that are already good. So yeah, that's going to do it for this video. If you enjoyed it, click the like button, of course, and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video.